Okay, so last week, you remember we covered Judaism and Islam, which we are moving geographically to the east now. We're going to go to Hinduism, and then we'll end with Buddhism tonight, both of which have their origin in the subcontinent of India. So that's going to be our focus, that part of the world. So we'll start with Hinduism, and you probably know some bits and pieces about Hinduism, and they're probably true in the sense that Hinduism is an extremely diverse religion, and we'll look at some of the reasons for that definition. It is a mostly, and we're always going to have caveats when we're talking about Hinduism, a mostly polytheistic religion, primarily in India and Nepal. We'll look at the geography at the end. Polytheistic meaning, of course, multiple gods. Many often. They don't believe in one God. They don't believe necessarily even in a pantheon like the Greeks or the Romans would have, or maybe the Egyptians, but perhaps many, sometimes thousands. But it is only a mostly polytheistic religion because not all Hindus have that idea. Hinduism is basically all of the various Indian cultural folk religions that developed independently and together and interacting over time. So it does not have a single founder. We do not say Muhammad founded Islam, Jesus Christianity, Abraham Judaism, Joseph Smith Mormonism. We don't have that person. There is no one person because it began in many places and grew over a long period of time. It's very ancient. There's no unified system of belief. All right, there's no single system of soteriology, which is our fancy theological way of saying if you talk to multiple Hindus, they won't agree on how one gets to where one wants to go. All right, how do you get to the goal? What is the path, right? There's more diversity on that answer than there would be within something like Islam or Christianity. Even where we have our differences, right? Well, how we disagree about some parts of that puzzle, we're still using the same language and talking about most of the same things. That's not true in Hinduism. It doesn't have a centralized authority. There's no Hindu pope. There's no Hindu head of theological blah, blah, blah. There's nobody like that. There's a whole bunch of people with authority and a whole bunch of people with opinions, but no one person or no one bureaucracy. There's no structure like that. They don't have districts, or they don't have organized areas where they've got a bishop over this area, right, over his diocese. They don't have anything like that. So those kinds of structures and leadership that we're used to and that we have some connection to when we're talking about Islam, we don't have with Hinduism. And one of the quotes, and when I found it years ago, I forgot to write down who said it, but he said, this religion defies our desire to define and categorize it. Every time you think you've got a category, you say it fits in this box. You realize that little bits and pieces didn't fit. Or it fits in that category. It's polytheistic, well, except for the ones that aren't. And you have that same kind of thing. And part of the reason, of course, is that it's an entire subcontinent. I think most of us forget how big India is, and how different southern India is from northwestern India, from eastern India. All right? They're different cultures, different ethnic groups, different history, different, you've got jungle and desert, mountains and river valleys. It's all very different. It's big. And so it has this big, diverse history that became, over time, Hinduism. When we talk about sacred text, we have the same thing. There's no one sacred text. There's no Bible, there's no Quran, there's no Book of Mormon, there's no Hebrew scriptures where you can say, this is what we're based on. There are numerous diverse texts that are all really old, and most of those old ones were written in Sanskrit, which is an ancient script, an ancient language, and they've got two different pieces of it. One, the Shruti are the things which are heard, and the Smriti, the things which are remembered. Basically, the difference between sort of the oral tradition and the things that learned men handed down versus the things that they believe came from a divine source. Kind of like the difference between the Hebrew Scriptures and the Talmud, right, which are the commentary on it, or the midrash that they do on that commentary. You might have heard, if you've heard of any of these, you might have heard of the Vedas. They are the earliest form, the earliest record of Hindu scriptures. Many Hindus believe these are eternal truths. All right, ancient sages were given these, but by God or the gods or the deity or the divine or whatever. A lot of variety there as well. All right, this next one has a whole lot of stuff on it. I don't expect you to take it all in. I just want to show you the variety. Okay, within the Vedas, there are 4 types of Veda, and each Veda is subclassified by its text type. So in other words, it's more like an encyclopedia than a single book. There's all sorts of things. You've got the first one, which are mantras and benedictions, right? Prayers. The second one, rituals, ceremonies, sacrifices, kind of like Law of Moses kind of stuff, right? What do you do and how do you do it and what day do you do it on and what's it for, all that kind of stuff. And then you got a third set, which are commentaries on those rituals, ceremonies, and sacrifices, much like the Talmud, commentary on it. And then you've got another one, the Upanishads, that are about meditation and philosophy and that sort of thing. Your Song of Solomon, your Proverbs, your Ecclesiastes, right? The more poetic, the more philosophical stuff. And the ones that outsiders, non-Hindus know, the only ones that they've probably ever heard quoted or might have read a bit of or had it as a college text in a class you were learning would have been an Upanishad. Those were oral history that eventually got written down. So this stuff is ancient, it's diverse, it covers a lot of topics, and there's no one thing, if you're talking to a Hindu, that you could say, see, look at this is your own text, and this text says something. That text might mean nothing to that particular Hindu, because it might not be one that they care about. There's so much of it, all right? And so remember when we said the Quran was small? Well, the sacred texts of Hinduism are large and diverse and from many sources over many years with a lot of different things to say. And when you have that kind of background, you're going to come up inevitably with a diverse concept of who God is. And this might blow your mind a little bit. Within Hinduism, there are people who are monotheists, who believe there's only one God. There are people who are polytheists. There are many gods. There are people who are panentheists. All is in God. We're not all God, but everything that exists is within God. And there are those that are pantheists. Everything is God. Everything is a part of God. And there are pandeists. Everything is a part of God, but that God is more like a force than a person. That's some variety, right? And you also have atheists within Hinduism that don't believe there is any God. And so you don't have, we have these knockdown, drag-out fights within history of Christianity about the exact definition of the Trinity, right? How exactly is the human and divine nature of Jesus combined? And people arguing over that very specific question. Within Hinduism, we got a whole wide variety of stuff. And you can be a good Hindu following Hinduism and be very different in your beliefs about who God is from another Hindu. And that probably is because you're not from the same place. You're from a different part of the country, and your traditions, your cultural expectations are different there. One thing that, and again, when we say all Hindus, you invariably can find someone that doesn't, but in general, we have to say something so that we can have a conversation. Hindus believe that everything has a soul. Every living creature has a soul. Very different than Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, right? Where it's only human beings that have a soul. All living things within Hinduism have a soul, and that soul, called the Atman, is your true self. That's the thing that is eternal. That's the thing that endures. That's the real essence of you. The outer part is just the shell you're currently inhabiting. All right? Whether you're a plant or an animal or a human being or something else, your Atman is eternal. That's been around and it's going to be around And so pretty much everybody accepts that idea because it's really tied up in everything else. And we'll see. All of these things are built together. It might not make sense one piece at a time, but when we see the whole thing, I'll try to back it up and look at the big picture. So the second part of that concept of God, we've got two main ideas. We've got the monistic, pantheistic theologies of Hinduism, and the words are not going to help you any, but the description will. They would say that this Atman, this spirit that you have, is indistinct from the Supreme Spirit, from the Brahman, the Supreme Spirit. You can't tell them apart. They're indistinct. They're one and the same. So the goal of life, then, in this way of thinking, is to realize that your soul is the same as the Supreme Soul, that Supreme Soul is everywhere and in everyone. All life is interconnected. Everything is one. Okay? This is, and I'll use this also in Buddhism, this is Yoda in Empire Strikes Back telling Luke that the Force is in the rock and in the tree and flowing between everything. All right? George Lucas, in that writing the screenplay, very much influenced by Hinduism and Buddhism and a couple of these key ideas, and he sort of borrowed that. So in that part of Hinduism, the idea is just you got to understand how everything flows and everything's connected and everything is one. The other half of Hinduism would say that no, the Brahman is separate from our souls. It's more like God, separate from us, and therefore we should worship it, not find oneness with it, but worship that Supreme Spirit. And we'll call it Vishnu or Shiva or one of the other names, of which there are many, many of these names for God because of all the different localities. So you got two different aspects within Hinduism, people that think they're trying to be one with God and people that are worshiping God because of the way that they understand that. They get closer to being on the same page when we start talking about Dharma. And this is huge, all right? This is a concept that you might not be familiar with that you really need to understand Hinduism. Dharma is ethics, but more than that. They're the duties, the rights, the obligations that everybody has. All right? Every person has a dharma, and that is your place in this universe, your purpose, your function, your goal, your obligations. What are you here for, and how are you supposed to be? What kind of person are you supposed to be? That is your dharma. And your dharma is intimately connected to your caste and to where you are in the caste system. We haven't talked about the caste system yet. We will in a minute. It has a lot to do with what station you were born in life. Lower caste, upper caste, where do you come from? And that will determine much of your purpose and your place, and that is what you are supposed to do. Buddhism believes in Dharma, and Jainism and Sikhism, we'll touch on those briefly, as well as one that I didn't talk about because it's not big in the modern world, it was big in the ancient world, and that's Zoroastrianism. It's a real thing. It came about in India. It was actually a rival in this part of the world with Christianity for an interesting period of history. But all of these share in common the idea that every person has a dharma. Now let me give you some examples. Dharma, if you're a bee, is to make honey. That's why you're here. That if you make honey, you're doing what your purpose is. If you are a cow, your purpose is to give milk. Obviously, half the cows can't, they're talking about there. If you're the sun, your purpose is to radiate, to shine, to heat. If you are a river, your purpose is to flow, right? It's basically looking at the biology and saying, how can we maximize what this thing is supposed to do? It's something innate in you. Something you can discover, something you can develop, that you have, and it's almost like natural law. It's almost like looking at it from a Darwinian perspective. What do you do best? What are you supposed to do? What is the ideal version of you? And that's what you're supposed to do in life. A lot of that has to do with your caste. Well, what happens when you screw up your dharma? What happens when you don't do what you're supposed to do, when you fail to be who you're supposed to be? Then you get karma. Karma and reincarnation are the natural outflowing of the idea that the soul is eternal and will outlast the body you're currently living in, and that you have dharma. Because when you fail, that's where you get karma. Karma is literally your deeds. It refers to something that I think is very Newtonian. You know who Newton is, right? Isaac Newton. You might have learned that in physics, or they tried to teach you in physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? So if you do something in life, whether it is something in accordance with your dharma, then you will have good karma because you fulfilled your dharma. If you do something that is against your dharma, you are creating bad karma, negative karma. There's always a reaction to everything that you do, good or bad. And that piles up. It builds up. This is not fate, right? Like the Greeks believed in, as if we all have a predetermined path. It's not predestination like Christians believe in, as in God has a plan for each one of us. It's not that at all. All right? The gods that they believe in to one degree or another, in one way or another, they don't dictate your karma. They're not sitting around determining it. All right? They don't test humanity to see how we're going to do. They don't really have any effect on it at all. The only thing you could hope for from the gods in regards to your karma is that they might give you a little break. They might cut you a little slack on some of the bad karma, but that's it. Your actions in this life will determine your karma in the next. When you die, you will be reborn based upon your karma in this life. So we got the pile of things you did that were against your dharma, bad karma. We got the pile of the things that you did which were in accordance with your dharma, that's good karma, and we see we got more or less, right? How do these two piles stack up, right? Everything that's unresolved, right? Because you could murder somebody the day before you die. Well, that doesn't get a chance to resolve itself, right? Not in this life. Or maybe you murdered somebody and you went to jail, but you only went to jail for 2 years before you died. Well, you didn't pay for it, right? So that bad thing that you did, you didn't fully pay for, and so it's put on next life. It's bumped over, kind of like some of you have a cell phone plan that has a certain number of megabytes of data every month, right? And if it's a good plan, what you don't use in June rolls over to July. Of course, if you use it all and then some, then you get to pay extra. It's really, cell phone plans are karma. We could have a thought about that. That actually just came to me right now. It's kind of scary. So basically, you need to be reincarnated to balance the scales. Okay? If you had extra good, you're going to bump up in your reincarnation. If you had extra bad, you're going to go down. But you were imbalanced by necessity, of course. And so therefore, we're doing this thing again. And that re-karma'd, that extra karma, life after life after life after life, is called samsara, that rebirth through the process of karma. And that picture that's actually from a Hindu artist, kind of the idea of birth and maturity and death, and then we're rolling the wheel around again, just around. So it's what goes around, comes around, sow the wind, reap the whirlwind. As Christians, we believe in that a little bit. Right? We believe that there is a judge of the living and the dead, that everything will be recompensed someday. But we do believe that not everything gets fixed in this life, right? The righteous don't get all the reward they deserve. The wicked don't get all the punishment they deserve. But we don't believe we need to come back around to balance that out. We believe God will deal with that in the next life, the final life. They're taking a different view on that and saying, well, because it doesn't balance out, that's not fair, that's not just, that's not the way God, whatever, are going to operate, so we got to do this thing again. All right? And so the caste system developed over time as a outpouring of that, right? And it's entirely predictable when you think about it, okay? The caste system has 5 layers. It's like a pyramid. The smallest caste, the most privileged caste is the smallest number. Now, of course, every society works this way, right? Because there can only be so many people at the top supported by the people at the bottom. There's got to be more people at the bottom. It's got to be a pyramid. So we've got 5 classes. The Brahmins, those are the priests, right? The holy people, the ones doing ceremonies and sacrifices and rituals and all of that stuff. And of course, if you're a Hindu person watching this online, forgive my butchering of pronunciations. I don't pretend to have these all right. The Kshatriyas are the rulers, the ruling class, administrators, warriors, kings, potentates, that kind of thing. Notice they're below the priests. The Vaishyas, that's your middle class, right? Your millers, your bakers, your loom workers, of course, in the ancient world, and your farmers as well. People who have a trade. Your Shudras is below that, just laborers, not tradesmen, but just regular old laborers. And then, now in the Middle Ages in Europe, there's a class society like this, right? You've got rich people at the top, the nobility, which are the priests and the rulers and the warriors. And then below them, you've got the merchant class, the tradesmen and the people that have that kind of skill. And then below them, you've got farmers and serfs and peasants. But there's really nobody below them. You're at the bottom when you're a peasant. But in Hinduism, in the caste system, there's a bottom below the bottom. And that bottom are the untouchables. You might see also the term the Dalit or the Harijan. They are the bottom of the bottom. This is illegal in India today. It was made illegal when they declared independence from England, from Britain, following World War II, but that really hasn't stopped it at all. There's some little bits and pieces of it have gone the wayside, but the people still practice the caste system. They still believe in it because this is rooted in their religion, and it goes back 4,000, 5,000 years, depending, it's a long way. So specific issues of it, specific ways of treating various caste peoples are perhaps illegal, but that doesn't stop it. Now, why does it make sense in Hinduism? It makes sense because if you are born into a rich family, a family of privilege, a family of means, it was because you had good karma from the last life. You deserved it. If you're born in the dirt poor family with nothing, that's because you deserved it, because you did something bad then. All right? And so they just look at the station, the place at which you were born in life, and say that's what you deserved. And they become perpetuated over time. You can't get out of these castes. You can't marry out of your caste in most cases. You can't advance. Even if a lower caste person was successful and earned money and became wealthy, the rest of the people in the caste above them would say, who cares? All right, remember Titanic when they had the new rich, the lady, and the old rich people looked at her like, we don't care that you got money. You're not noble like us. It's that same kind of thing. And again, in the Middle Ages, there was this same kind of thing, right? Where if you were nobility, they thought that was God's special favor, the divine right of kings. You were put in this place for a purpose because God really likes you. Which, of course, was hogwash, but they looked at the circumstances and it fit their line of thinking. So the caste system in India is a deep reflection of that karma going around and around and around. Which means that if you challenge someone's status, all right, an upper class person, you try to bring them down somehow. A lower caste person, you try to raise them up somehow. You are thereby messing with that person or that group of people's karma. Say I open a school to better a lower caste village. Everybody in this village is lower caste, right? They're not untouchables, but they're the group just above that, right? Where they are. They're Vaishya. Oh, no, I'm sorry, Sudra. They're peasants. They're commoners. They're regular folk. And I open a school to better them, give them an education, turn some of them into doctors or something like that, or engineers. Bad idea. There are going to be some Hindus that are going to want to burn that school down because I'm screwing with their karma. And there would be some people within that low caste that would want to burn that school down because they don't want their karma pushed off to the next life. You're going to pay your karma no matter what. If something prevents you from reaping it all in this life, you're going to get it in the next. They'd rather get it over with now, right? Get all that bad karma, put it all on my head in this life so I can move up in the next, because don't delay it, don't mitigate it, don't try to take some of it away. And so what you get is a society that can't change, right? Nobody can go up, nobody can go down. You are who you were born to be. It's a knight's tale. I'm full of these, right? With Heath Ledger, a knight's tale. You can't be a knight. You can't move up. You're fixed in this place. All right? And so why would you interfere with someone else's karma? Why would you help someone who's down on their luck if they're lower caste? If you interfere with their karma, that's probably going to come back and bite you in the next life. You're not just keeping them from reaping their karma, but you're messing with their purpose in life, with their dharma. You're doing something you shouldn't do. That's going to hurt you next time. There are 150 million people, and of course the statistics are hard to get exact, more or less, in India that are untouchable, out of just over 1 billion. So it's 15%. Not everybody's a Hindu, but so let's call it somewhere in the ballpark of 15% of the people are untouchable. And untouchable is a great word for it. It means you wouldn't even want to touch them. If you are any caste above them, any of the 4 castes above, they're not going to touch you. They can only do the worst jobs. Trash collector, sewage, working in a slaughterhouse. I mean, the grossest, most menial, the ones that Mike Rowe does on dirty jobs, those are the only jobs they can do. The jobs nobody else wants. And at any time, now again, much of this is illegal now, but that doesn't always stop it. Much like when Jim Crow stuff was made illegal, it didn't necessarily disappear overnight because people said, screw you, we're doing it anyway. It takes time for people to unlearn that. Well, if you're untouchable, you could be paraded naked, beaten, raped by impunity with an upper class Hindu. And in parts of India, the authorities wouldn't do squat. They're not going to mess with it. You're untouchable. Imagine what you did in the last life to be untouchable now. You were probably a serial killer, a rapist, a scum. You were scum. So whatever you get in this life, you kind of deserved it. I mean, imagine that, right? The caste that you're born into, people look at you like you were a child molester because you were born in that caste. And so therefore, in your last life, you must have been horrid. You're vile. And so people treat you like dirt. Who cares? Merely walking through an upper caste neighborhood could get you murdered if you're untouchable. And that's not just me hating on Hinduism. That was from National Geographic. They're not just make that stuff up. Doesn't mean it happens all the time, but it means this is very serious business. You don't mess with caste. But again, is that not the way it was in, I want to say the South, but in other parts of America too, during the Jim Crow days? What happens if a black man looks at a white girl too long? What happens if he kisses her? Right? Did you not read To Kill a Mockingbird? You had to read it. What happened to the Northerners who went down to the South to try to help people in Mississippi vote? Did you not see Mississippi Burning? I'm trying to see how many pop culture references I can come up with. They murdered them because they were trying to get them out of their proper place. All right, you have to think of it like that. But it's not about race per se. It's about class. All right, now class and ethnicity and where you're from, those blur together, but it's on a different basis. All right, they don't hate you because of, or look down at you because of how you look. They look down at you because of who you are. Not a lot you can do to change that. And so, of course, the untouchables in Calcutta, which is where Mother Teresa worked, they were dying in the street, leprosy, all sorts of stuff, and nobody cared. All right, the parable of the Good Samaritan doesn't work in the caste system if the man bleeding on the side of the road is untouchable. Then it would make sense that the priest walked by and didn't help him, because that's what he should have done. He's doing what karma dictates. All right, so you got to pull your head out of our way of looking at these things, and of course admitting that in our own history, in American and church history, we can find some ugly examples of this kind of thinking, but it was for very different reasons. All right. So she worked with them, opened up a clinic, fed them, clothed them, gave them medical care, but locals wouldn't do it. All right, and some locals didn't appreciate it at all. And again, that kind of thing. It's not as strong as it used to be, but it's still there and still very real, and it's an intimate part of Hinduism. All right, it makes sense within Hinduism because of dharma, karma, and reincarnation. Okay? We got a handle on that. It's a lot to think through, but as you'll see, it all flows together. It all has a common idea. Well, what else are Hindus up to? All sorts of temples, tons of festivals, lots of pilgrimages, and they're mostly caste-specific or regional. All right, where you were born and what caste you live in, you are from, decides what festivals you participate in, what pilgrimages you take, what devotions you do in the home. And so you can't just say Hindus all they don't have their own Passover, right? Like all observant Jews are supposed to celebrate Passover. It's kind of mandatory. It's a big deal. It's not like that in Hinduism. There's so many of them. You go to one part of India, they're different than in another part of India. They might look kind of the same to an outside observer, but they're different. One of the things that comes from Hinduism is yoga, controlling the mind and body. It actually feels more at home within Buddhism, but it originated in India. Many Hindus have said, well, living things have atmans, so we got to be vegetarians. I got to eat something, but we won't eat animals because we're going to focus on lower life forms that were probably not as nice, so we won't eat meat. There are a lot of idols in the temples. That's ancient and pretty common. And then, of course, the thing, if I said, tell me something about Hinduism, half the people, if they had nothing else, would say there's something about cows. I know something about cows. There's cows everywhere. They just wander the streets, and that's true. There is a big cow taboo that somehow in the system they developed as being sacred, and you don't mess with cows. And so you got a lot of cows. But there's if you watch enough seasons of The Amazing Race, they always go to India. There's a temple where rats are sacred, where they're running everywhere, and people leave offerings for the rats. Yeah, they made the contestants go through that barefoot because you have to go barefoot, and some people were freaking out. I mean, that's just the kind of thing. It's a local thing. Hindus 1,000 miles away in another part of India wouldn't participate in that. So within this broader thing of Hinduism, we've got two small groups that you might bump into or know about that I just want to mention briefly their connection to Hinduism and their slight differences. And we're only going to one slide on each. The first are the Jains. Jainism, it's pretty small, 4 or 5 million people, most of whom live in India. They're focusing more on the idea of nonviolent non-attachment. All right, which is a very Buddhist kind of idea. Asceticism, self-denial. All right, they believe in dharma, karma, and reincarnation, just like Hindus. as with Hindus, they've got their own rituals and festivals. That's fine. They believe that your soul, that once you liberate your soul through that self-denial, you can become a siddha. You can become a holy person who has that ability to sort of become detached from life. That's, again, very connected to Buddhism, which we'll talk about next. And the only one significant difference here is the Jains believe that your soul, while permanent, can change. Whereas a Hindu would believe that it's permanent and unchangeable. And just since we're talking about it right now, Buddhists would say, no, it's not permanent. So there's again, the practical difference, you might not notice the difference between a Jain and a Hindu, whereas, of course, someone from India would, because many of the things they have in common. And then another group that you would notice and recognize just because they dress differently are the Sikhs. The turban's a dead giveaway, as well as the dagger. About 25 to 28 million of them, most of them in Punjab, which is one of the states in India. Relatively modern, 15th century, monotheistic or panentheistic. Again, there's some variety. They are all about meditating and about the unity of humankind. Founded by a man named Guru Nanak. He said there's no such thing as absolute truth. It's a subset under Hinduism, more or less, because they also believe in karma and reincarnation and all of that stuff. And if it weren't for the turbans, you'd probably never have heard of the Sikhs. And because many of the migrants that have come to Europe or America, they stand out because you wear something different. So where are the world's Hindus? Well, 81% of the people in Nepal, which is above India there, are Hindu. That's 23 million people. That's a good number. 79% in India. That's a high percentage, and that's 960 million people. All right? So if you see this map, we're going to get to, there's a little bit of color in South America and a little bit over there in the Pacific. It's almost entirely in India. But India's got more than 1 billion people now. So if you have 80% of the people in India, the number is really high. Okay? And then the other ones, and there's some migratory patterns here. Suriname and Guyana are in South America. You got about a quarter of the people there. And then you've got places like Sri Lanka, which is the island to the south of India, where it's 12%. Bangladesh to the east, it's 10%. Fiji out in the Pacific, or Mauritius out in the Pacific. But those are small numbers relatively. In the United States, we're talking less than 1%. Okay? Not very many people at all. Almost all the world's Hindus, by number, live in India. But it's a lot of people because there's a lot of people in India, and it's a huge subcontinent. The maps that we typically use make India look smaller than it really is. And we've got these projection maps that make the north look bigger and the south look smaller, and which is pretty typical because you got to make a globe unflat, right? You paid attention to geography at some point, didn't you? Well, what about Hinduism and Christianity? What's the relationship? Interestingly enough, the third largest religion in India are the Christians. What's number 2? Who knows, been paying attention to what happens in India lately? Muslims, about 20%. It's a big minority, and mostly in the West, and there have been some unrest, to say the least, some terrorism, there have been some fighting. But 28 million people is not a small group. That's a lot of people. It's just a small percentage in India. But notice the map. I'm going to point this out. This is like 0 to 1%, hardly any. Down here, you got 5 to 20%. It's a little bit. Over here, you've got 1 to 5. This was 0 to 1. Almost nobody, a little bit more. But notice over here, this is above 50%. This is like 80%, 80%, but there's small little states way off to the east there. Not sure how that happened. I haven't studied the history of India to know exactly how that concentration happened there. Most of the missionaries that you heard about in India were on the coastline, down like right here where there's a little dot, because that's where the trading was happening, and that's what brought them there. History is not sure, but the legend is that the Apostle Thomas himself made it to India before he died and founded a church there. The building on the bottom is supposed to be the church founded by St. Thomas. We don't know because there's no archaeological proof one way or another, but there is a work in Syriac, which was the language that the people of Syria back then were utilizing, speaking and writing, that was from the 3rd century called the Acts of Thomas. It's not in our scriptures, of course, because it's from the 3rd century. Thomas didn't write it. He was dead for a couple hundred years by then. But it's called the Acts of Thomas, and in the Acts of Thomas, Thomas goes to India. That idea came from somewhere, and we know that by the 6th century, there were Christians in India. Now, 1,000 years later, you get the first Catholic missionaries sailing around the Cape of Good Hope, right? Portuguese and Spaniards and whatnot, sailing around that way for trade, trying to bypass the Muslim control of the spice trade by going around Africa. They show up under guys like Francis Xavier, super famous, and they try to convert the Hindus and have some success, but a lot of confusion. But they also met people there that had some kind of Christian ideas, and like, where did you guys come from? All right, there was still something alive there. It just had been a long time in isolation. I mean, 1,000 years is a long time. And then 2 centuries later, the Protestant missionaries show up, the most famous of which would be William Carey, and they have a go at it as well. Again, neither group extremely successful. They had some inroads. Both groups had great success with schools. People were happy to send their kids to the schools the Christians offered, because they were very good schools, but not many of those ended up in converts. All right? There has been, and this is a good thing, relative peace in India between Hindus and Christians. All right? Not a history of purges or war or massacres or that sort of thing, which is good, because it's not true everywhere between different religions. So what gets in the way when you're trying to talk to a Hindu, in general, so to speak, about the gospel? Well, number one, there's going to be some apathy. Hindus believe that they're going to be reincarnated. You're telling them this is a decision for eternity, and they're like, I'm going around. You're asking me to get off here, like this is the most important stop. When I'm going around. Why? What's the big deal, right? What's the rush? Because they believe in reincarnation, as does almost everybody east of India until you get to America, aside from the Australians and the New Zealanders. Aside from Indonesia, the Muslims there, the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Confucius, the Taoists, they all believe in reincarnation. So why not? We're going around. Secondly, if you are upper caste, why on earth would you buy somebody telling you you need to repent to be saved? Were you born yesterday? I'm upper caste. I'm a good guy. I'm a hero. I'm one of the winners. What do I need to repent for? If you're lower caste, and that's where almost all of the gospel success has occurred in India, there's people that could use some hope, because they've been told, ugh, you're a mess. You're past. Oh, my goodness, what did you do? To have someone come in and say, God's willing to wipe your slate clean, make you white as snow, that has some chance. But the upper caste, yeah. And again, the thing that tripped up the Catholic and Protestant missionaries when they first came is people said, Jesus is God? Sweet, we believe that. And they said, ooh, we won, whew, we got it. And then they realized they still had Vishnu, and they'd add Allah, they'd add Buddha, they'd add anybody. Just if we need more gods, just tell me who they are, right? Paul going to Athens and saying, you got a statue that says to an unknown God. And they're like, thanks for telling us his name. We were waiting. Now we can write his name on there and we'll keep going as we were. Because there's no absolute truth, all right? This idea that all religions are true, they're all different paths to the one, that's very Hindu. That fits right in with Hinduism. No one religion has got a corner on the market of God, they would think, for the most part, because there's so much diversity in their thought, right? They don't, this whole thing that we do about this is what is true, right? This idea of heresy and dogma and all that stuff, that's just so foreign to Hinduism. How is it going to fit in a society where there's that much variety on basic ideas about what is God? Well, this, right? Lots of stuff. So you're talking to a Hindu about the gospel. You've got some serious bridges to build, some questions to overcome, and it is a major challenge. It's not the most difficult society in terms of gospel witness. That's probably Japan with Shinto, and we'll get to that one next week. And I'm obviously not talking about countries where you can get yourself killed by being a Christian missionary. That's a whole different piece of the puzzle. But I'm talking about the people's acceptance, their willingness to accept. It's a very difficult one. Questions about Hinduism before we move on to our second one and tackle Buddhism? All right, so we got one more, and we're going to tread a lot of the same ground. So a lot of the stuff we already discussed, we're going back over it again from the Buddhist perspective, which is going to, I hope, help, which is why I put these two together. So that is, of course, the question, what is Buddhism? And you've probably seen the statue on the left, have you not? Some people have them in there like as a book end or something like that. It's the little fat guy. Usually he's more rotund than that. And then the guys on the right are very recognizable as Buddhist priests, Buddhist monks, because just the color really stands out in the shaved head. So what is Buddhism? Well, believe it or not, Buddhism started in India, somewhere between the 6th and 4th century BC. So that would be after, at about the same time as the fall of Jerusalem to Nebuchadnezzar. Down to about the time of Alexander the Great. That's the time period where Buddhism develops. All right, so it's before the time of Christ. It's ancient. It's not as old as Hinduism, of course. It's not as old as Judaism, but it's pretty old. And from there, it spread throughout Southeast Asia. But interestingly enough, in its home turf in India, it basically died out. Buddhists are a very small minority in India where they began, but there are huge majorities in Southeast Asia where they didn't begin. It's just one of those weird things of history. We've got two primary branches, right? In Hinduism, we had the people that believed that that your spirit was the same as God, and people who believed that your spirit was distinct from God, and so therefore you should worship God. This is similar in that we've got two sides with a different perspective. Theravada, the goal is to escape this rebirth thing. All right, you're on the merry-go-round, and you need to figure out how to get off. That's the goal in Theravada Buddhism. The other one, Mahayana, the goal is to attain Buddhahood, that enlightenment, to become a wise one, and then share that information with other people as you continue to be reborn. You're not so much looking to get off as to become a guide for other people so that they too can join you. Okay? So half of, I say half, but of course we don't have good statistics on how much are one and how much are the other. One part of Buddhism, they're trying to get out of reincarnation. The other, they're trying to become enlightened as they continue to be reincarnated. So who is Buddha? Buddha is an actual guy. His name's Siddhartha Gautama. There's so much legend, so much myth, so much actual history mixed together, it's almost impossible to determine. He probably lived in the region where India and Nepal's border is, in that mountainous region. Exactly when he was born, exactly when he died, hard to say. But some things are known. And the thing that about him that set him on this path was that he looked at human suffering. And he said, this is a joke. This is no good. All right? People are suffering in life. Right? The problem of evil is what we would call it in Christian theology. Bad things happen. And then they're reborn, and it happens again. this isn't any good. That's what he said, right? He said, I'm looking at this. Life is bad, and then you die, and then you do it again, and then you die, and then you do it again, and then you die. This is not good, right? He said, I got to fix this. We got to figure out a way to get out of this because this repeated suffering is ridiculous. We need to find a way to either end the suffering or end the existence, because who wants to keep doing this? And I would say that if reincarnation were true, the man's got a point, right? How many times you want to live this life? Right? If you're going to do this 1,000 times, it's going to get real old. Now, of course, the question is, would you know anything about the fact that you've done it before? But still, I mean, life, as good as it can be, it's got suffering in it. Your body breaks down, and then you die. Ugh, don't do that again. And so he said, we got to figure out how to get out of this. So he went to the Vedic teachers, to those Hindu holy men, those ancient holy men, and said, what do you got? And they offered meditation. All right? He said, okay, can I meditate my way out of this, right? Can I deal with suffering through meditation? And he said, that doesn't work. So he tried asceticism. Can I get rid of suffering by self-denial? Which, of course, if you look at early church history, there were ascetics. There were hermits that believed that the key to holiness was to go live out in the desert and eat bread and water and suffer. And it would get you closer to God. Wrong, but they thought that was a path, and the early some of them were very much revered in the early church. If you want to learn about that, watch my church history class. Free advertisement you didn't ask for, but you just got it. But that didn't work. And he said, self-denial is not getting me out of suffering, and it's not going to help me with the next life. What do I got to do? So we went back to meditation, and the legend has it that he sat under a tree and he thought. And he wasn't waiting for an apple to fall and hit him on the head. That's a different guy sitting under a tree. He's sitting under a tree, he's thinking, and eventually he attains enlightenment. He figures it out. It's called the middle way, and I'll tell you what the middle way has got in it. And he figured out, now I know how to end suffering, and now he becomes a Buddha. He becomes an enlightened one. So he's sort of transformed by his enlightenment, by his wisdom from an ordinary man to a Buddha. Not a divine being of anything, just an enlightened person. And people listened to him. He went out and got followers and founded a school, and then he died. So what do Buddhists think about God and our souls? Most Buddhists might use the name of Buddha. They might pray to Buddha, but they certainly do not think that Buddha is some sort of supreme being. They don't have a supreme being. All right, and we're going to focus in on this. For Buddhists, the question of God is immaterial. Who is God is a waste of time. What does God want? What is God about? That's not the point at all if you're a Buddhist. Now, it matters in Hinduism. They talk about that a lot. It certainly matters in the monotheistic religions, but it doesn't matter in Buddhism because nothing is fixed. Nothing is permanent. God is not permanent. The supreme being, whatever you think it is, it's not permanent. The human soul is not permanent. Ultimately, within Buddhism, nothing is forever. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is fixed. Everything can change. So we don't care who God is because God, whether I believe in him or not, whether he likes me or not, he can't fix my problem. My problem is human suffering. My problem is karma and reincarnation. And since God, and remember, the Hindus don't look to God to fix your karma, right? If God, and your sacrifices, your pilgrimages, they don't get rid of your karma. All right, now again, the church has a little bit of that in its history. Might have mentioned this when we were talking about Hinduism, right? If you die on crusade, then you get out of purgatory. If you do indulgences, you get out of purgatory. You can kind of ease your burden through acts of holiness or sacrifice as a martyr. That doesn't exist in Hinduism. That's not helping you, and you have to pay for your karma. And so the Buddhists say, if I got to pay for it, if it's my life and I have to pay for it and I'm the one that's got to resolve it, then what do I care about God? Why waste time on God? Because God's not part of the problem or the solution. It's not God's fault. It's not God's responsibility. God's not going to help. So if you want to believe in God, go right ahead. If you don't want to believe in God, go right ahead. They're not going to argue about it. All right? So they've taken God or the gods or the supreme being or whatever you want to call it or not call it right out of the equation. It's all on you. So what do they say about this whole dharma, karma, reincarnation thing? Well, Buddhists like the Hindus, the Jains, the Sikhs, etc., they believe in dharma, karma, and reincarnation. That's how we got here. Remember, it started in India. Your rebirth depends on your merit or your demerit in your past life, therefore your karma, right? Same as Hindus. And this is a slight twist, as well as what is accrued on your behalf by a family member. Just remember how the Mormons said you could get baptized for your ancestors? They got a little bit of that going on in Buddhism. You can transfer for your extra good karma. My question would be, how do you know you got extra? And you're willing to give it to your family. That seems like a risk. But you can give it to your ancestors, not apparently the other direction, but the people that led to you or to your family members. You can share a little. Each one of your rebirths is defined by 6 different realms. The first one sounds decent, heavenly. That's not bad. Demigods. Hey, that doesn't sound like you did well. Human realm. Hey, that's us. You made it in the middle. Animal. You weren't a complete jerk, but you did something wrong because you moved down. Hungry ghosts. That sounds bad. All right, your existence is wandering this world in some way like a hungry ghost, much like the Greeks believed that the souls that didn't find rest would wander, and that's part of Homer's tales as well. And then, of course, the bottom of the ladder is hellish. I don't know what you got to do to end up in hellish in your next life, but it can't be good. So, and one last thing, which makes this all the more remarkable. In Buddhism, as opposed to Hinduism, your intent creates karma just as much as your actions. In Hinduism, you're just trying to fight off your bad actions and outbalance them with the good actions. Now, as a Christian, we believe this, do we not? Doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, not going to work. God's going to look at that and say, yeah, no. Right? That's what the prophets said, right? Isaiah said, stop bringing sacrifices, you're making me sick, basically, because your hands are full of blood, you're an unjust people, and so your sacrifices are meaningless. Your intent, your heart matters. Add that in, you're trying to balance out your karma, your actions, and your intentions. That feels harder, does it not? Not only do you have to have good karma, you have to have good karma with good reasons, with a good attitude, with a good heart. So, yeah, good luck with that. But he said, I got a way. I got a path. I've figured it out. There's 4 things you need to understand. Don't worry about the names for them, Buddhist names for them. We'll just look at what they say. Number 1 is that we cling to and crave things that are impermanent or unsatisfactory. In other words, you eat, but then you're hungry again. You sleep, but then you're tired again. People have sex, and they enjoy it, but then they want it again. Nothing satisfies. Nothing ends the quest. Nothing is permanent, right? And we know this. You get fame, you get power, you get wealth. What do you want? More of it. You want it to never stop. You're on vacation. What do you want? Never go back to work, right? Let me just keep this up for a while. What's the saddest day is the first day of school, right? You got to go back. Summer vacation was a joy, but now I got to go back. Sorry, kid. I was a teacher for 10 years. Believe me, I know about the saddest day. And so everything that is not satisfying in life causes sorrow, regret, pain. But that's what life is, right? What can we gain that we can't later lose or need again? We love people and then they die. All right? That's the nature of life, right? Much of that is what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, right? You toil for what? Nothing is new under the sun. Nothing changes. You live, you die, and then people forget you were here. I mean, he is talking about some of this same stuff. He's going to end up with different conclusions, but he recognized some of that same problem. And he said, because you are so unsatisfied with the life that you're living now, that leads to samsara. That leads to you being reborn to try to get better. Right? You live a life, you're unsatisfied, you tried to make things happen, it didn't work, and so you come back around again. Because this life was not satisfying. The attainment of nirvana is thus stopping the craving. Stop it at its source. Stop wanting things that are not permanent, things that do not satisfy. Stop craving. Stop the envy, stop the greed, stop the lust. Put a stop to the desire, and therefore you won't have the pain, and then therefore you're dealing with this rebirth issue. Now, that's the hard part, right? How does one stop desire and craving and urges and needs? How does one get off that? Because that's not easy. And he said, well, I got a plan for that. It's called the Eightfold Path. There's 8 points to my plan. And if you follow my 8 points, then you'll get out of this whole pain business. So step number 1, recognizing where pain comes from. Step number 2, that pain leads to the recycling, the rebirth. Step 3, realizing you need to get off of the desire business. And step 4 is, okay, here's how you do it. So step 4 is actually God parts 1 to 8 to it. And we'll get to those parts in just a minute. Now, I'm a Star Wars nerd. I can't help myself. That's what Yoda says to young Anakin in The Phantom Menace. Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. That's Buddhism. And of course, suffering leads to you doing things. And what happens to Anakin in the prequel trilogy? He learns that the woman he loves is going to die. He can't deal with the pain, and therefore he tries to stop it. And it turns him to the dark side. He tries to ruin the karma, I guess, that was coming his way. It's very Buddhist. So you got an eightfold path. And so in Buddhism, you're going to have a lot of 8-sided figures for your art that outline these 8 things. I just wanted to show you that. Now I'll break them down. There's some overlap. Now what Buddha said is that we need to be in the middle. The key is not asceticism. It's not self-denial. And the key is not hedonism. Again, there's little bits and pieces. That's what Christians say, right? Self-denial is not the path, and neither, of course, is hedonism, that just dive right into satisfying all of your cravings. That doesn't work. And they also want to balance the idea that your soul is permanent with the idea of your soul ending. So while your soul is, in a sense, something that's very much here, because it's going to come around, it doesn't have to be. You can put an end to it. So what's the 8 things? I'm just going to briefly look at them. There's 8 of them. Number 1, you got to believe in karma, reincarnation, and those 4 truths we said before. You got to get on board with what they believe. Makes sense. Number 2, you need to peacefully renounce things. In other words, let go of your attachments, your cravings, your desires. You need to peacefully let them go. There's a Disney song about that that some people hate. She's talking about something else when she's saying let it go, but you got to let it go. All right? And again, that's what Yoda says to Luke, right? Let go of your anger. Let go of your hatred. All right? Don't try to control it. Just go with the flow. So that's number 2. 3, you got to speak true and kind words. I'm all for that. Number 4, no killing, no violence, and sexual self-control. So in other words, control yourself. Number 5, don't be a source of suffering for anybody in any way. That's kind of a do unto others as you would have them do unto you kind of thing. But don't be the source of anybody's suffering, whether it purposefully or inadvertently. If you're causing someone else's suffering, make it stop. Figure out how to get out of that, because you don't want to do that to other people. Number 6, and this is interesting because this one comes up twice, guard against sensual thoughts. You had to have sexual self-control, but he's also saying, oh, by the way, if you're going to have that, you better cut it off at the thought source, right? It's not just the not doing. You got to do the not thinking before you don't do the not doing. Which again, Jesus said the same thing in that sense, right? He said, you look on a woman lustfully, you're already down the road. Number 7, you need to focus the mind. Don't just let your mind wander. Be aware, be thoughtful. Concentrate, right? And number 8, you need to meditate, because you're going to need that. There's a lot of hard stuff. All right, so there's a lot of stuff. All right, thinking, attitudes, feelings, your mind. This is the kind of thing that isn't going to happen overnight, right? You don't walk into the Buddhist temple and say, all right, 8 things, I'll knock these out by tomorrow, then what? Right? This is a lifetime's pursuit to try to get a handle on this. And I would assume, I don't know how many Buddhists think they have a shot of getting it figured out in this life. Because they believe they're going to come back around again. If they don't, they're either going to become enlightened and not have this problem anymore, or they're going to become enlightened and cease to be born, and this will be their last life. But I don't know how many of them think they're getting close, because this is hard, right? You're telling people with self-control, control your thoughts, your actions, your words, your attitudes, your behaviors. Don't hurt anybody. Don't say anything bad. In other words, be a saint by yourself, on your own. Right? And again, Paul said, good luck with that, because it doesn't work that way. But that's the path. So this is rigorous. This is the Marines of religion. You got to work at this. So where are the Buddhists? India is orange because that's the Hinduism, so that just had the numbers. Notice the Buddhists in India, 0.8%, hardly any. But notice Southeast Asia, 95% in Cambodia, 95% in Thailand, 89% in Myanmar or Burma, 55% in Vietnam, 60% in Laos, 75% in Bhutan. We don't have numbers for Tibet because, of course, the Chinese government doesn't want that. We don't have numbers for China because the Chinese government doesn't want that either. There are good numbers there's a lot of Buddhists in Tibet. There's a good number of Buddhists in China, although we'll look at China next week when we look at Confucianism and Taoism. There's a lot of people in China taking some from kind of the smorgasbord, a little of this, a little of that, so they might be also Buddhists. Mongolia, 90%. South Korea, almost half, and Japan is almost half. Many of the people in Japan that are Shinto are also Buddhists. So basically, Southeast Asia is extremely Buddhist. A whole lot of Buddhist people there. And that, of course, adds up to a lot of people. Last bit of who to talk about before we talk about Christianity and Buddhism is the Dalai Lama, because he's the world's most famous Buddhist by a long shot. He is the leader of Tibetan Buddhism, right? We were just looking at Tibet. Tibet was at, well, they didn't have a number, but that's this region, right? That's this country right here. And by calling it a country, this video will no longer be aired in China because you're not allowed to call it a country. It wasn't going to be aired in China anyway, I know that, but that's okay. This goes back to 1578, so the Dalai Lama's been around a while. They believe that that's the reincarnation of this same enlightened person again and again. So when the Dalai Lama dies, another person is born who is that same spirit, that same soul, that same individual, and he's a enlightened person who knows compassion. That's his thing. He's solved compassion. The guy that's got the job right now, his name is Tenzin Gyatso, but everyone just calls him the Dalai Lama because, you know, that's easier. The Chinese government does not like him because he belongs to the Free Tibet group. He belongs that Tibet ought to be a free country independent of the communist government in China, and he's in exile. He can never go back home, and he's actually quite old, and when he dies, there will not be another Dalai Lama because the communist government will pick a Dalai Lama, and the Tibetan Buddhists will say, nope, right? He's not the Dalai Lama. You can't choose our Dalai Lama, and they're not going to be allowed to pick another Dalai Lama. This will probably be the last one. They may name one in secret, but he won't be someone that you have probably ever hear of because of the government situation there, unless, of course, something dramatic changes in Tibet, which does not seem likely in the next few years. So, an interesting thing. Well, what about Christianity and Buddhism? There is a unique thing with Christianity and Buddhism, and it goes back to the history. It's called syncretism, and that is when you take two religions or two belief systems and you kind of mush them together and have bits and pieces of both. Syncretism happened quite a bit in the New World in Central and South America, where Mayan or Aztec or Incan beliefs got mixed in together with Catholicism, and so you can't always tell where the one ends and the other begins, whether the people are true Catholics or whether they were still holding on to their ancestors' worship, because there's a little bit of both. Well, syncretism happened in the Far East along the Silk Road. You've heard of the Silk Road, right? The Silk Road is that trade route that leads to China that connected east to west. Marco Polo thing, right, later on. The Christians that went east were Nestorians. And you've never heard of the Nestorians, and that's okay, but the Nestorians were a small group. Back then, they had some decent numbers. They believed that Jesus was actually two people. There was the Word of God, and there was the man Jesus. They were two distinct beings, so to speak. Whereas the rest of Christianity is trying to say, this is how they balance out, this is how they fit together. They were like, no, they're actually two people. He's one body with two people in him kind of thing, which is different. But that's the group that went east, and they met up with Buddhists, and they kind of mixed the Buddhism in with it. And as I pointed out, right, there's some stuff that a Christian could get on board with on the ethical thing, right? About self-control, about not causing suffering for other people, about controlling your sensual desires. There's some stuff in there. And so they kind of said, well, we'll take what you got and we're gonna tell you about Jesus and we're gonna mix it together. So much so that there became a medieval church of the East in China that put together something called the Jesus Sutras, which are Buddhist philosophical stuff that talk about Jesus. So they're basically talking about Jesus from a Buddhist perspective. It's an interesting combination. It's in Chinese, written in Chinese from the 7th century. It takes Christianity, Buddhism, and also throws in a little Chinese Taoism too. So there is a history of some of blending there. Well, what happens if you try to share the gospel with a Buddhist, right? What are the barriers going to run into? Well, they're very similar in some ways to Hinduism because, like the Hindus, the Jains, and the Sikhs, you got karma and reincarnation. And you're going to have to come up with an answer for that, right? Why is there not karma and why is there not reincarnation? Why does this life matter? Why will God judge beyond this life finally once and for all instead of through a bunch of different lives? You got to have an answer for that, or reason, something that they're going to understand and be willing to accept. Now, the second thing, again, the Hindus said, hey, there's lots of God. Your God, my God, our God, doesn't really matter, right? Sure, Jesus is God. Why not? Add him to the shelf. Whereas the Buddhist is like, all right, so Jesus was a God too. Good for him. Because it's beside the point. It's not part of the conversation. God is irrelevant in Buddhism because he's not going to help. So if you come there saying God can help you, they're like, help me with what? Right? Because they got a plan. It's a self-reliant plan. If you went to a Buddhist and said, Christ died for your sins, you need to be saved, they're going to look at you like you got three eyes. What do you mean be saved? Saved from what? Well, what I got to be saved from is being born again and reborn, and suffering again. And so we're talking about two very different things. They're trying to achieve nirvana, that state of getting away from the suffering or even ending their own existence. And in that system, in that self-reliance, right, we had the 8 things you got to do. There was no mention of grace in that. There was no mention of forgiveness. There was no mention of help. Aside from the fact that you can throw a little good karma to your family, nobody's getting grace. Nobody's getting assistance. Nobody's getting help. You got to do it. It's all about you. So again, that flies in the face of salvation by grace through faith. I mean, we're talking about two very different approaches. And again, Buddhists, like many Hindus, have no problem with mutually contradictory truths. That's a big Western problem, a Western idea. That's Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian culture says you can't believe two things that are true at the same time. Right? It's either up or down. It's either left or right. 2 plus 2 can't be both 4 and 5. All right? Now, in the East, in India, in China, in Southeast Asia, in Hinduism and Buddhism and some of these other groups, it's not such a big deal. Not necessarily in math, but in philosophy, in religion, in ethics. Two things could be true. That's true, sure. But maybe this is true too. Right? It's that idea, and I've heard this one before, and it's a very Hindu-Buddhist idea, that when we're trying to find God, we're climbing a mountain. And from where we stand, it looks like our way is the right path. But when we get to the top of the mountain, we're going to look over and say, the Muslims were climbing the other side. And there's the Hindus on the other side. And there's the Buddhists. Silly people, we were all climbing the same mountain. We thought we had the right way up. And now we realize how silly that was. And the Buddhist is going to be like, yeah, see, it's just, that's true, but what's your point? All right? So again, we have very different ways of looking at life and truth and the afterlife and all of these things. It's a big gap. All right? So rather than, with a Muslim, you're arguing, is Jesus a prophet or is he the Messiah? It's a very specific thing that you're kind of arguing. With a Hindu, with a Buddhist, you're in very broad territory about life and what's going to happen next and all. It's very philosophical, very, very deep compared to those very specific questions that we're debating with Judaism and Islam or Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses. Those are very specific questions. These are very broad terms, very broad ideas. So it's a different kind of evangelism entirely. Questions about Buddhism before we wrap it up and shelve the last ones for next week?
I've got a question.
Sure.
Might not. It does kind of apply to both of these.
All right.
Aren't relative ethics and situational truths grounded on these two?
Well, the idea that there's no absolute truth could lead to relativistic ethics, but you balance that out with the idea of dharma, that everything has an absolute purpose that it's designed for, that it ought to achieve. So that shouldn't be relativistic per se, because as a human being of this particular caste or that particular group, you ought to have a pretty defined path. So it might seem like it, but I think that's balanced out by the idea of dharma, because karma is pretty cut and dry. Either it's good for your karma or it's bad for your karma, and of course you might have debate about whether it is or isn't. But if it's good, it's good. If it's bad, it's bad. So I don't think they necessarily are going to go down that path per se. Other questions, other thoughts, other comments on Buddhism or something that from Hinduism that's been bouncing around for 45 minutes and now you need to ask it? Okay, there's a lot of stuff. I get that, and it's very foreign to our way of thinking because, of course, this is the East-West divide, right? This is the East. We're in the West. There's that line that between India and Afghanistan where with Pakistan in the middle there, where things are very different, the way people think about everything. All right, we'll wrap it up there then. Push the button.